Hello, everybody. We've got a guest today whose name is Jeb Smith. Now, he's written a book called Missing Monarchy, where he claims that monarchy is, in fact, a preferable political system to what we are living under today, which is, for the most part, some version of democracy. Now, I was incredulous at first, but I started to read his book, and monarchy, sorry. He uses the word a little bit differently than we've come to think of it. So, Jeb, tell us a little bit about what you mean by monarchy and how it contrasts with the perception of monarchy that most people have in their heads.
Right. First off, thank you for having me on. And it's a great question because I used to think of monarchy as I think the typical American would or any citizen in a democracy, and that's basically a dictatorship. And so I thought kings could create law, kind of do whatever they want, and people didn't have a right. They were the government. They were kind of above the law. Whatever they wanted to do or go say. And there has been dictators, especially in ancient times. A lot of the pagan nations, there was a lot of dictators. But what I focused on as I started researching this, the 14th century was the most transformative century, I think, in the history of the world, at least as far as Europe and America are concerned. Um, from around 700, the conversion to Christianity of Europe's conversion to around 1300, we had a very different political system that I describe as kingship. And so monarchs came about in the 14th century as Roman law returned, secular Roman law returned. And that's where you get the idea of obedience to the king, or today we have obedience to the state, where the king is a ruler over a geographic realm. Whatever he says goes, sort of thing. He's able to create law, and he's the head of all the people. And so kingship, in England, there's an exception. I'm looking at Anglo-Saxon England before the Norman conquest. But as a general rule, it's around 700 to 1300 AD, and kingship was prominent across Europe. And so a king was very different than a monarch. The kingships during that period were actually extremely libertarian, even anarchist in a lot of ways. And the king, so to compare it today, if conservative Republicans won every election, local, state, and federal, across the country, you would have a more authoritarian government today than it was under King George. King George was an absolutist monarch, and he was far more authoritarian than kings during the Middle Ages. So that just kind of puts everything into perspective of how we can't really compare thinking that we are free today, as far as if you look at what the government controls in our lives compared to even King George, and then you further go back further to the Middle Ages, and it's so minuscule. So the kings are king of their people. They're the king of the English. They're the king of the Franks. They don't rule a geographic realm, which is why realms came and went, houses, rulers came and went, because they were kings of the people, not of a geographical era. And the king cannot create law. He gets his authority from the law. So it comes from tribal customs, and people separated into their families, separated into kin groups, and they created their own customs, the people, and they said, this is how we want to live. These are the rules and regulations we want to live by. Our king, kind of like a head patriarch, is going to serve us. He's going to, usually he's the protector and the warrior, but he's going to do what our laws say. And so he's the guardian of the law. He's not above it. All his power comes from the law. He's not above it. He cannot manipulate it in any way. Thomas Aquinas said, people are not made for the prince, but the prince is made for the people. And during these centuries, very Christian Europe, they looked at law as they did in the Bible and the Ten Commandments. So in the Ten Commandments, law is written in stone. It does not change because it's based on eternal truths from their perspective. Like you cannot, or don't lie, don't kill. Those are eternal. They're set in stone, and people's customs are set. So a ruler or a
Mhm.
majority cannot change them because it comes from above. A ruler cannot expand his powers. He cannot increase taxation and take someone else's property, because that is theft. So he is stuck within his limits, which were extremely limited, and he could not go outside of those bounds. And he was, again, he could only do what the customs of his particular people allowed him to do.
Yeah,
I
that
want
was
to
the
quote,
I was gonna say that was
historian Fritz
sorry.
Kern explains this very well. He says, law is old. New law is a contradiction in term. According to the medieval ideas, therefore, the enactment of new law is not possible at all. And all legislation and legal reform is conceived of as the restoration of the good old law that has been violated. The Middle Ages knew no genuine legislation by the state. The ordinance of laws in the state aim only at the restoration and execution of valid folk or customary law. The law pursues its own sovereign life. The state does not encroach upon that. It merely protects its existence from outside when necessary. Whole centuries elapse without the slightest sight of legislation or ordinary activity in our sense. And French historian Regine Pernoun wrote that the medieval king possessed none of the attributes recognized as those of a sovereign power. He could neither decree general laws nor collect taxes on the whole of his kingdom nor levy an army. And as I described it in one section of my book, I said there was no active form of government molding or adapting society. Instead, it was reactionary. Government and law only came in to render justice after a disruption of the peace. It was anarchist as that there was usually no government. It rose like a wave and then faded until it was needed once more.
That was the impression that I got as I was reading your book, was that instead of, 'cause we think of law today as something that the government makes. They're always legislating, like you said, always making new laws all the time. But it seems like under the kings of the Middle Ages, as you mentioned, that it was less that they were making the law and more that law existed
Mm-hmm.
and they administered the law.
And,
If
and,
they're
and and basically, he's kind of sitting on the sideline until an event happens where he comes in. He's more like a judge, I guess you'd say, in that respect. He doesn't control the people or adapt them the way we do today. Like in America, I don't have the statistics. I cite it in the book, but in 1 year, we passed more laws than existed throughout the entire Middle Ages. That's how many laws we're adding on each year throughout. You take all the realms, there's hundreds of them in feudal Europe, and we're adding more laws each year in America than that
it's
existed throughout
horrifying.
hundreds of years. And it's the mindset. If you have professional politicians whose job it is to pass legislation and have all these backers and interest groups pushing them one way or the other, they're going to be passing legislation. And eventually you're going to get the wrong people in power, the people that
Mm.
want power, that want money, that want to control you. And we're going to end up how we are today, where we're continually manipulated. And, I think people think we're free, but in comparison to the Middle Ages, I don't see how you can say that at all
Mm.
because we're controlled to a great extent.
And now, speaking of that, you said that the Middle Ages under the kings were more libertarian or even anarchist
Mm.
than today. The area of fewer laws, that seems to fit. Were there any other ways where these kingships may have been more libertarian and anarchist than current democracies?
In the way I see it, the biggest change, what I love the most about the Middle Ages was its extraordinary decentralized. So, like if you're the king of the Franks or the king of France, he only owned, as I'm sure you read in the book, he only had a small territory of royal lands under his control, and he struggled to control the vassals within his own lands that he's rightfully supposed to be the ruler of, and so it's very libertarian or anarchist in that the central power affects a very small percent of people. The king does not interfere with 99.9% of the people. He has no authority, no control over them all.
Mm.
So Europe is made up of hundreds of realms, dukedoms, towns, and they're autonomous, and everyone kind of has their own thing. So it'd be like libertarians over here, Republicans over here, Democrats over here, and everyone has their own laws to live by. And people move from town to town, and they choose or on manors, and they choose a lord. And so it's very consent. When I think of libertarianism and anarchism, I think of the lack of control and the lack of force, which is what government is. And so, in that way, by you choosing your customs, everything's reciprocal. It's consent and it's not force. And that's the way in which I'd see it as libertarian or
Mm.
anarchist, is that you're not, for the vast majority of people, you are choosing your own form of government, and you have thousands, hundreds or thousands to choose from. And in those obligations, like, I just want to give you one more quote here, or an example of how decentralized. In 800 AD, Ireland had 150 separate kingdoms, and they did not have a large population. By 200 AD, there's 200 autonomous city-states in northern Italy. In Germany was made up of 600 different realms. And so, especially even on the manor, which people put serfs and people in that system, we think they're oppressed and stuff. But I'm going to quote Mark Morris here. He said, "For centuries, the rural economy had remained essentially unchanged. Great lords, kings, earlmen, bishops, and abbots held vast estates extending over dozens or even hundreds of square miles. Within these wider areas, people lived in settlements that were spread out and scattered. Isolated hamlets or clusters consisted of a few adjacent farmsteads. The farmers rendered produce to their overlord or sometimes rent, but beyond that, their existence was essentially free and independent." And I think that's something we cannot understand today, is that basically that was your only obligation. If you didn't own your own land and you're on a manor, you pay him some of your produce, no matter how much it is. Say you produce, I don't know, 100 bales of hay, say you give him 20. The rest of your life is free. He doesn't care about controlling you, controlling your family, regulating your housing and all that. He just
Yeah.
wants what the agreement was. This is the land I'm giving you. This is what I want. Beyond that, you're completely
Mm.
free. And so it's
Contrasted
very
with today,
libertarian or
that's
anarchist in
yeah,
that.
contrasted with today, that's seems very, very refreshing compared to the this mass of regulations that are
Right,
entwining every part of our lives.
right.
But so that's the description of people living on the manor, the feudal estate, as you say. Were there people who were not in that situation, who did not have to owe to a manor lord or nobleman?
Right. Yep. There was people that simply lived off the grid.
Hmm.
The roads, the lack of central government allowed, the rural nature, low population allowed, especially like in Scandinavia. Every country had your rural areas where people just lived off the grid, and they kind of lived in their own village, their own custom. They had their own property. There was a lot of, just property owners all over the place, but the towns were always considered free. A lot of people that didn't like being on a manor, that were raised as a serf, said, this is not for me. I'm going to a town. And so the towns were considered free and autonomous. And but at the same time, they could go find another place to live or buy land, or work to gain money to go then buy land and live on their own. But a lot of people, in various circumstances, usually they were negative circumstances, such as Viking invasions, or you run into tough times, or a plague comes through and you're no longer able to make it on your own. Where here's a rich aristocrat that's offering me land. I can start over. I'll be able to survive. I might not appreciate having to pay the rent, or not having my own land, but it's better than getting torn apart by Vikings or dying in a plague. And so a lot of them ended up, going on a manor for those reasons.
Okay. So then under normal circumstances, let's say there's the serf on the manor and he owes to the lord owes to the king, people who are not living on a manor in
Mhm.
the town or something, did they owe any fealty or taxes to the king? How did that work?
Well, usually not to the king. Usually they would have some sort of lord, if they had a lord, if they weren't independent and autonomous. I mean, there were just lords, especially among the bishops, that were just given huge amounts of land from another powerful lord or for a king, and ruled autonomously, and they would give it to their friends, and for diplomatic reasons just hand it out. So there's a lot of people who are lords that own their own land. And there's, like I said, there was a lot of peasants that were not under a lord at all. But the hierarchy starts with the king. And let's say he has 10 powerful vassals. They owe loyalty to him. and they themselves have large tracts of lands that they've handed out to lesser lords, usually knights, and their payback was military service, usually at the high end of the hierarchy. And so he would command his knights, and then they would in turn give land to the next level down. So the average, I mean, very few people actually gave fealty to the king, but a lot of people had a lord above them or a lord below them. But again, like some of the requirements for a lord, usually it was just an honorary thing, or it was giving a gift, or going to his council, or something along those lines. It was not, the manor is the lowest level. So there's multiple levels depending on where you are and what time in the situation of the hierarchy, that you're both below the king, where you don't even interact with him, and above the manor system as well.
I think uh,
There was no one set way, and it varied from region and time as well. So you can't really say that it was all one way in one district too. So it was,
okay.
like think about America, how much we've changed in 150 years, 200 years, and trying to identify 600 years of Europe through hundreds of different realms. All you can
Hmm.
do is generalize.
Yeah. I think people tend to think of the all of the manors and fiefdoms as just a monolith. They all had the same rules, did things the same way.
Right.
That's kind of what we're used to in the modern day. But you're saying not at
Not
all.
at
They had
all.
different kinds of rules.
Right.
Okay. So the popular conception is that when someone was under a lord, the lord had like all power over them, could do whatever they want,
Mhm.
take their stuff, whatever. Is that really the case, or is that another misconception?
Though, I mean, those things did happen, but by law, that is not what was supposed to happen. Throughout any time period you go to, you're going to find examples of tyranny and people in power subjugating people below them, acting against the laws. But yeah, the Lord is he's the same thing. He has the customs of the people. That's how it originally arose, and so he's limited to what he can do, and he's supposed to be a servant of them. There's certain things like at wartime where he can raise certain taxes and things like that. And if people are refusing to pay it, there's instances of him going in, a king or a lord at different levels, and taking it. There was one, and some of them were just plain disputes. I remember reading there's a French lord, kind of a mid-level lord, and he went through, he won crusade. He thought his people were supposed to pay it by the customs because they weren't written down. Usually law was not written down. It was lived out, and the people disagreed, and he went by force, took it, and went off. So people can find examples like that in the Middle Ages
Mhm.
of tyranny. But by and large, as a whole, when a lord did that, the church condemned him, the people condemned him, and it's a it's interlocking. So say you have a powerful lord who has 10 vassals underneath him. He's given out 10 fiefs to all the people. If he abuses one of the vassals, all the other vassals are going to see that, and they're going to rise up against him and say, if he's doing it to him, he'll do it to us as well. We need to protect our other vassals, right, who's being abused, or we protect our own rights by protecting the vassal who the lord above him is being abused. And that happened at every level of society. So whenever a lord abuses people, his people are going to leave. The church is going to help rebel him. Other people, other vassals, other peasants are going to unite, overthrow him. So there's a lot of checks and balances that existed at that time period for when lords went astray.
And when, because eventually that started to change, right? Because the
Mhm.
I think the conception that most people have of kingship or monarchs, as you put it, which is, the king owns everything and has makes the laws, we said earlier, that did actually happen, but it was later on. How did that transition start to happen from a local king of a people who followed the customs and the law that existed to a king of a geographical territory who made the law to his own benefit?
Yeah, that was the return of Roman law in the 14th century, and the characteristics of the emperors of old, the old Roman emperors, was brought back into kingship, and kings morphed into monarchs, and monarchs are kind of the ruler of a territory. I am above you. I can tell you what to do. Whereas before, the kings are servants of the people, limited by the people's law and custom. Now it's saying, oh, the emperor is a law. It later became the divine right of kings, which is actually a Protestant, of Protestant origin. But that spread saying, God's kind of put each king in power and place, so you have to listen to him. Whatever he says, he kind of speaks for the king, or he's in the role of the king. Whereas in the Middle Ages, they had rebellion to tyrants as obedience to God, and they thought the law was the king because the law derived from God, not people. Or people can abuse the law and try to go beyond it. So when a king or a lord acted tyrannical, went against the law, he was really going against the people. John of Salisbury said, I'll be obedient to the king or the lord so long as he follows the law. As soon as he steps out, I can no longer go along with him because he's now at war with God. That's a paraphrase. That's not a direct quote. But what he's saying is a king is a legitimate king. And I quote multiple documents in different church lords and theologians. And they're saying as long as a king follows the law of the church and of the people, he's to be respected. You're supposed to give him fealty. As soon as he steps outside those bounds, becomes tyrannical, goes against the people's law, he's now at war with God because he's saying, I'm above God. I can create law, or I'm going to be the ruler instead of what God put these limitations on what a ruler is supposed to do. And so they'd actively rebel against him. And so it's a completely different mindset from obedience, like what we have in democracy. If a Republican or a Democrat wins, we still have to follow the laws. We'll be thrown in jail if we don't follow the laws. Doesn't matter if we vote at all, if we vote against them, there's obedience there. We're forced, we're coerced to follow the laws of the nation. And that goes back to that 14th century. It actually began with monarchs saying, you have to follow this ruler. And later that got transferred the sovereignty to parliament or elected officials. But that sort of thing did not exist in the Middle Ages. The only sovereignty was the law, and any man, majority, or king who violated it he was no longer a lord. He was a tyrant at war with God, and the Christian people are supposed to ignore him and be an obstacle to him and prevent him from implementing what he wants to do.
I can see that fitting into the ideas they got from Roman law, because for what I understand of Roman law, at first in the Republic, it was the people voting and decided on the law and voted for senators, etc. But then later on, there was the emperor who was essentially a god, and he decided what the law was. And so take those both, put them together, and
Right.
you've
Yeah.
got the European monarchs of the later
Yeah.
ages. Whew.
Right. And yeah, that's the thing is who has the ultimate sovereignty? Is it a man who's in power, or is it the law and the people and the customs? And so any sort of system, whether you had the sovereignty in elected officials, in a Supreme Court, a president, or emperor, if you're expected to be obedient to anything they do, you end up with Hitlers, you end up with people like that. And that's just a completely different mindset. We think it's normal, and because it's in democracy, obedience is taught in democracy. And if you don't follow it, you face consequences. But back then, it was the opposite. It's like a person is under the law. He's simply supposed to do what it says. If he doesn't do what it says, he's not a true ruler anymore, and we're going to ignore him or resist him or whatever it is.
Mm.
And that's where the reciprocal nature of feudalism, choosing your lord, choosing your customs, and free will, which I associate with libertarianism, is prominent during the Middle Ages, which is part of why I like it, because it's like, okay, you don't like it, go over there, go with this village, go live on your own. You have all these options, and you're not being coerced by a central authority. And like I said, the central authorities owned very little of Europe at this time. Very little sections. They didn't interfere with the other autonomous lords who had their own customs in villages and towns and homesteads and all that.
Now that all sounds very good. One thing that I thought of as I was reading the book was, okay, this sounds good looking back from our current perspective, but we've had a lot of changes over the what 1500 years since then, including a lot of economic changes, technical
Mm-hmm.
development. We have better medicine, etc. right now. technology, electricity, and a lot of those things, it seems to me, were economic developments that came after the classic kingship started to fall away, and there was
Mhm.
the Enlightenment, and history is escaping me right now.
Capitalism, I would say the
Yeah,
rise of capitalism, of
yeah,
merchants,
yeah.
which played a role in the demise of feudalism in the Middle
hmm
Ages.
Yeah. So
So
the question I thought of was, could all of this wonderful technological advancement have happened under the old kings, or was that fall necessary for us to be able to have this conversation, for instance?
yeah, I'm not an economist to answer that. I know you've read Democracy, the God That Failed,
Hopper. Yeah.
he would argue that it happens in spite of our government system, that monarchy would actually improve it. I'm not 100% sure. I think the best economic system is probably somewhere, I don't know, 85% capitalist, 15% socialist. That's just my own opinions. And so I do think that our economic system is better and it lends towards technological advancement more as well. But to me, the question is not so much what's best for the economy or what's best for technology and convenience, but what best provides self-government and what provides the most happiness overall. And I know there's a lot of people that would not have the same preferences I have. Money is very low on my list of importance. It's when I think politics, I don't even think about money. And I know most people, that's probably their top thing. So a lot of people would disagree with me. So to me, that as far as I know, especially decentralization is not favorable towards a lot of the technological and economic advances that we've made. So I would say that is a just criticism. And if we kept the Middle Age kingships, we would not be in the place economically or technologically that we are today. But at the same time, I think we've lost a great amount for that. And is the financial and technological gain worth what we've lost?
Mm.
I would say no. A lot of people, especially today, would probably say yes. But my main argument is not that it's a better economical
Mm.
political system, because I don't say that at all. I'm just saying it's better at self-government and liberty, where
Mm.
my main focus is.
That's a good point that it's difficult to make those kind of value judgments because value is subjective. But I think
Mhm.
more and more people are realizing that compared to olden times, even 100, 200 years ago, we've lost a lot of the family and community bonds that used to support society. And those were much, much stronger, of course, when the government was more and more distant, like in the days of the kings in the Middle Ages.
And that's one of the things I'd say that we miss the most. And psychologists will tell you what people need to be happy, to be healthy, is a close-knit community of like-minded people. And that's how they lived in the Middle Ages. They were all like-minded. They lived in the same little communities. You didn't have the internal strife that politics, you weren't dividing up family. Like capitalism sends people away to school, and then it sends them away to go work at a job in another state, and then they're flying around. They're going to across the country, and people's priorities gets turned to business, to making money, all that kind of stuff, and it's breaking apart families. It's causing a lot of ill effects, in
Mhm.
my opinion. And it's not, I say the family as we think of it today, but it's really the extended family and a local community. It's really like what they said, it takes a village to raise a person, I think it is what the saying is. And if you lived in a close knit community of kind of like the Amish do, everyone helping each other out,
Mhm.
I think you'll find a lot of people not having the sort of emotional and mental issues that plague our society, and depression. You wouldn't have families falling apart. Might not be economically as good, but we're missing out on a lot, I think, and a lot of happiness as we
Mhm.
dedicate. We hurry along, we're driving, we're going to work. I think we just miss out on things that are very important in life.
Yeah, and the modern government plays into that as well with, for example, government schooling, taking away the
Mhm.
child and
Right,
training it to go now to the next school
right,
and then to get a job and so you
right.
can pay your taxes.
Leave your
Uh,
parents, go find yourself, go to the city, work for a
mhm.
corporation or work in a factory, whatever it is. Yeah. for
Yeah,
sure.
so the problems they feed off of each other.
Mhm.
That leads me to another question that I thought of. This, let's say someone accepts everything you wrote about the Middle Ages. Yes, this is wonderful. We Things were great under the kings back then, but what could be done about it nowadays with the pervasiveness of the state,
Right.
uh, democracies, democratic republics everywhere? Is
Mhm.
is there a possibility of going back, bringing the monarchies back, some kind of hybrid system that could be achievable? What do you think?
Um, I'm not sure about a hybrid system because if you're talking about somewhat like a constitutional monarchy or having a parliament and a king, I mean, England has one. Um, I don't think that really works. I think the only way it would really work, there'd have to be some sort of revolution, hopefully bloodless, but I don't think it'd happen. There'd need to be some sort of secession. You know, you get a small group of people, a town, a county saying, we want to secede from whatever country they're in and we want to start our own thing and do it autonomously and implement it fully what they want to do and set those laws in order. But I don't know how you bring it out through political action. It'd be impossible with the tools we're given in a democracy to go about it in a normal political way. It's just not going to happen. As long as the government educates people's mind too, you're never going to have a majority, and that's the tough thing about democracy. You need a majority to implement your ideas, and then you're just forcing it on the minority anyway,
Yeah.
which is already against, voluntarism, libertarianism. It's like in Lord of the Rings, you have to use the ring to get your way. You're already committing an evil in the first place to try to bring about what you want to do. So it'd have to be on some small scale somewhere. I don't know. A government has to allow its population to leave and start its own. And I just don't see that happening in Western democracy. I couldn't imagine, in America saying, okay, a county, you want to go start your own thing, go ahead. We're just going to let you go because that's going to catch on. It's going to catch on like fire. And then all of a sudden, liberals and, the county in California are going to say, well, wait a second. If they're doing it, why don't we do it? And then conservatives in Texas were doing the whole thing will fall apart. And so I can imagine a government today allowing that to occur. So I
Hmm.
don't know how to do that.
It does seem more and more likely, to me at least, given the deep divides in the United States between right and left, particularly, but
Mhm.
also people who just don't. I mean, they say, "Oh, Donald Trump won. He's got the popular vote, so he's got this mandate from the people." But still, uh, when I look at the numbers, most people didn't vote.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
he might have uh, most of the voting public voted for him, and he might have a mandate from them, but not from everyone else.
In
Um,
reality, how many of them voted for the lesser of two evils?
yeah, did
You
they
know?
vote for him or did they vote
Right.
against
Or
Kamala
did the
Harris?
parties kind of say, here's who we're getting. You can either vote for our party or their party. I don't know if
Mhm.
there's anyone that says they completely agree with their party. Within the Republican Party or Democrat, they'll disagree on a whole host of things. But like you said, I think nationalism has taken a hit lately, especially in America and with the younger generation. And that does give me hope that something could happen in the future because there's less sort of the nationalistic blind patriotism that I think former generations had, that kind of, this is America, this is the best country, supposedly, and whatever happens, you follow it and you obey it. That blind obedience was so strong in former generations. And I think, especially coming up, people are saying, wait a second, I really don't like what that other party's doing. They're diverging quite a bit, and they're saying, I don't want to be forced to live under someone like that. I think they're evil. And the other side is saying the same thing. And so when you get enough people that cannot stay on the other side, I think you may come to an agreement like, why don't we just break this thing apart? America founded, I don't know how many people was it, like 3 million, I think, were
Probably.
originally here, spread out throughout the colonies, which were diverse. Now you have in one state, you can have, 10, 100 times that population, forcing so many diverse people with different opinions under the same political system is madness to me. I don't, it's the complete opposite of self-government and voluntary, life. It's
Hmm.
forced. So yeah, hopefully people start to look that way and seek to actually achieve self-government instead of voting for the better of two evils.
Yeah, we can hope so. Now, I thought of another, excuse me, another point. So I was reading the book. You focused a lot, I think you had a whole chapter on Christianity and the effect specifically of Christianity on the kings of the Middle
Mhm.
Ages. Now, uh, the question I wondered was, is it possible, in your opinion, for this kind of kingship to exist separate from Christianity? And if not, what does that mean then for people who are not Christian?
Yeah, I think it has existed. One area I want to research is kind of my next area is feudal Japan. And I think the same thing happened in feudal Japan, but the religion was different. Instead of Christian, it was Buddhist. And a lot of the pagan dictators really had the same sort of thing, except that their religion kind of made a man God, and then he could do whatever he want. Well, if you make a man God, he's going to turn into a tyrant. It's kind of inevitable. And so I think it can happen. It could happen with secularism. It could happen with any sort of worldview. It has happened. And I have an appendix of what my ideal monarchy. If America turned into my form of monarchy, there'd be thousands of autonomous realms. And so you wouldn't have to be a Christian. Only one area would have that kind of Christian monarchy, and only the people that want to live under that system would live there. It wouldn't be forced on anyone else, because I think that violates Christianity in multiple ways. So you'd have, communists, you'd have socialists, you'd have Democrats, you'd have secularists, Mormons, Catholics, Baptists, whoever it is. Everyone would be able to split up and have their own form of government. And you'd have, again, like the thousands. So I would never want to force a Christian nation or Christian laws on people who didn't want it. But if you're a secularist and you want it, then yeah, come live here. Just as some Christians would rather live in a secular society as we have today. And so I think everyone should have the choice. That's one thing about the Middle Ages, with heretics, they were not given the same sort of freedoms and liberty, at least in public. They were not allowed to spread their beliefs in the same way Christians were. So
Mhm.
um,
And I've
yeah,
got
if you're not Christian, you shouldn't live under that sort of system. It's not for everyone, for
so
sure.
that made me think of another uh, question, not directly related to the kingship issue, but kind of more of a moral religious quandary.
Mhm.
Anyway, so a part that you mentioned in the book, it was in the law, the chapter on Christians, um, was, for example, uh, having laws that reflected Christian values. An example you gave was law against uh, adultery. So
Mhm.
laws, let me see how you put it.
Or abortion, I think it was.
I'm going to use that one too. Of course, my e-reader shuts off. But content. Yeah, I said a law legalizing divorce and neglecting to punish adultery would directly affect the salvation of the next generation. Of course, you can't have that in a Christian society, and so it has to be enforced by the law. But to
I
go
think that
on,
was that was a bishop in the Middle Ages that I was quoting, that he was saying, if you allow divorce, you allow adultery, it's going to pull apart the family, which would then negatively affect society as well. And
mhm,
and I think he was saying, that's why we have to have laws to prevent those things from happening. Are you
mhm.
asking if I would have that
Well, not.
in my ideal? I was trying
mm,
to give their perspective in this instance and their mindset behind some of the Christian laws.
Okay. Yeah, because what I thought of was I understand that perspective that they had, and what I thought was, okay, these laws come from God, right,
Mhm.
in the Bible, but God is not only all-knowing but also all-powerful, so omnipotent. So if forcing people to obey the laws was a good thing, it seems like God would have already done that because he has the knowledge and the power to make people do that. But since he's not, wouldn't it then
Why would
follow that
people?
that's not the right thing to do?
Yeah, I
But
think, and maybe a Calvinist would disagree with you, but God is not all powerful. The Bible says, God can't lie, He can't sin. There's certain things that God can't do,
mhm,
and God chooses not to interfere with free will. That's the one thing throughout the whole Bible. Like, there's multiple instances of God saying, "Please stop doing what you're doing." I'm like at one point, they're sacrificing children, ancient Israelites, and He said, I could never imagine it coming to this. Stop doing this. I'm going to punish you. I don't want to punish you. I'm going to send a plague or something. Stop doing this. Please stop doing this or whatever. Jesus is like how I want everyone to be saved if you're only willing. And so there's a lot of examples of the Bible where God could interfere but chooses not to with free will. And that's where I actually probably would maybe disagree with that bishop. I mentioned in my form of Christianity be very Thomas Aquinas like, in that it'd be very libertarian. There's certain things that should not be outlawed, but they should be frowned upon by society as a whole. You don't encourage divorce, you don't encourage adultery, you don't encourage things by your society. I'd say music videos, a lot of movies, TV, we in many ways encourage those things. And so in a sort of Christian society, if it were a Christian society with Christian laws, you wouldn't have that. Like you'd have, like Christians have their own TV stations. I think there's like Pureflix, there's Christian movies, and they present a certain worldview and perspective, and they do not put a positive spin on adultery and things like that. Instead, they'll make movies about the damaging effects of adultery and things like that. And that's sort of the culture that I would be looking for. It doesn't mean there'd be a law against it, but there'd be this cultural pressure that this is not something that's accepted. It's only in extreme circumstances, and we're not going to encourage it. People are sinful. People do things wrong all the time. We understand it's going to happen, but we're not going to encourage it in our society. But it doesn't mean we're going to outlaw it.
it makes me think of what you said about the law coming from the traditions and culture of the people
Right.
and not vice versa with the law determining the traditions and culture.
And I
Uh,
mentioned in some of those tribal laws, like murder was controlled by the family. So in some families, if you committed murder, if say, these are extended family tribes, and say one of the nephews commits murder, it's up to that family to enforce the punishment. Some of them might have capital punishment, some might have other, and it was dependent on the families. And I would think it'd be more like that. The families don't want a bad name. They're going to raise their kids with the culture. That's where the most powerful culture, in my opinion, should come from, is the family and the family name. And it was like that when I grew up. I had an Irish grandma, huge extended family, and you didn't want to shame your family. You didn't want to go out and cause trouble like some of the kids who, maybe their parents were divorced, didn't have a large extended family. They didn't have a lot of culture influencing them in a positive way. And so they were more likely to do things because they're not upsetting people. Whereas me, I had this huge extended family that if I did something, everyone in town knows everyone in my family. It kind of gives them a bad name. And it was kind of a preventative, at least for a while before I started getting in trouble, to keep me out of trouble. And so that's the sort of culture that I would prefer rather than governmental force and
mm,
law.
yeah,
And
not
I
only
think that's a Christian culture.
yeah, and not only that, but it works the other way where if you do something, it gets back to your family, and then your
Right.
parents, your grandparents come down
Yeah.
on you.
Right. And they punish you in their own way as their grandparents did. It's kind of like tradition. And
Hmm.
so I think when we had times like that and the family was around, the extended family, the local community, people didn't raise hell as much and didn't get in much trouble. And I think that's one of the reasons why. So that's the sort of influence I would be in my ideal
Okay, so then the Christian ideal is not being enforced by the law, but
by the
coming
government. Right.
from the people.
Right.
I see. It's
And it's more of a preventative. It's like you want to prevent the law or the breaking of the law in the first place. So you want as many measures to prevent having to deal with a bad situation.
And
That's
if
that. Go ahead.
I was gonna say if the situation never comes up in the
Right.
first place, or hardly does, you don't
The
need
law
a
doesn't
law.
matter.
Yeah, it's like I
Right.
think Ron Paul said abortion shouldn't be illegal, it should be
Right.
unthinkable.
Right. Yeah. That's perfect. And I had the same discussion. I think I talked about in my book with my son, who talked about abortion laws. I said it's not going to stop people from getting abortion. What matters is in their heart and in their mind. If you're, and there's my viewpoint, if you're a secularist and you don't believe in God, you don't believe the baby's image of the divine, and you think it's just an evolving creature in your stomach, and you've been raped, something like that, and it's inconvenient, it's going to ruin your college, you're not going to have many obstacles to having an abortion. Whereas in another circumstance, if you're married, you get pregnant, and you believe other things, there's going to be preventions from that happening, and your mind and your heart are going to be in a different place, which is going to lead. So you could have legal abortion. I think that's how I word it in the book. You could have legal abortion in, like, have born again evangelical Christians, who I think are the most prominent against or wanting to outlaw abortion. You could have legal abortion with them, and very few would be aborted. You could have another political, the opposite political spectrum, have abortion illegal, but they will find ways. They'll go out of state. They'll, get stuff through the mail. They'll find a way to have an abortion. And so laws don't change hearts and minds, and that's why I don't think they should be rarely used when you negatively affect someone else, and they can't stop it, and then that's when the government would step in at the law to execute justice.
Hmm. And
Let people go.
it seems more and more nowadays that the law isn't for executing justice. It's for trying to force other people to do what one party or person thinks they should
Right,
do. The quote that I really liked in the book, as you said, democracy is one big war of people denying each other self-rule. I
right.
thought that was a great, a great one sentence description of bam.
Right.
That's
Yeah, I have a. Can I read the Lysander Spooner quote? Because I think
oh
he put it really well.
yes, yes.
Um, yeah, in the 19th century abolitionist Lysander Spooner, this was his summary of democracy. A man finds himself invited by a government that he cannot resist, a government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forego the exercise of many of his natural rights under peril of weighty punishment. He sees, too, that other men practice this tyranny over him by the use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from the tyranny of others by subjecting them to his own. In short, he finds himself, without his consent, so situated that if he uses the ballot, he may become a master. If he does not use it, he becomes a slave, and he has no alternative to these two. And I think that's exactly what democracy is.
Hmm.
If
I
you get
think
your way, you're stealing it from someone else.
I think that's how it gets the buy-in from so many people because it presents this dichotomy. Well, you can be on the winning side or you can be on the losing side. You can force other people or you can be forced. And I think from a moral perspective and a perspective of just
Mhm.
human flourishing,
Yeah,
that's basically wrong and
right.
evil.
Yeah,
And I think what you talk about in the book is really looking back, almost kind of yearning for a time when that wasn't the
right.
case, when people didn't think like that.
Live and let live. Right. I even talk about in my book, even a lot of times when in a foreign lord, like even the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, who differed in their religion, differed in many ways, one of them would come in, take over the territory, but they allowed the people to keep their customs. They simply had a new lord because it wasn't in their mindset like we do. We remake a country in our own image. Like think of World War II, and I'm not saying I'm fond of Hitler or Japan or anything like that, but we definitely remake them in our own image to our own benefit, and we put economics on them that's going to benefit us in the long term. In their mindset, it wasn't that at all. It's like you have the right, you have the dignity to live how you want to live. These are your customs. I'm not going to change them. When the Crusaders went into the Holy Lands and they took over, they allowed the Muslims to keep their own lords and keep their own customs. And it just wasn't the same mindset as we have today of dominance. And I think I'm a huge Tolkien fan, so I bring it up a lot. But if you read Lord of the Rings with that mindset, I think he's saying the evil is wanting to control other people. And you look at the political systems of the free people, they're all very diverse, decentralized, and hobbits and dwarves and men live together and elves, and they allow each other. There's no thought to try to outvote the other and try to force your customs on them. It's like, no, we're friends. We have a live and let live attitude. You live how you want to live. We'll live how we want to live. And it's Zaron and Zaraman who want to control everything under their command and force everyone to do what they do, which is what democracy is. It's just a big mob, trying to force their way on others. And
And I was thinking of that because you mentioned Lord of the Rings in a footnote, and so I started reading those again too. But I'm in the Return of the King now, and one
nice.
thing one thing I had heard presented by some people against the concept of the Lord of the Rings really being a libertarian, even
Mhm.
an anarchist work was, oh, but then Aragorn is a king in the end, and he's the king of everything, so that can't be right. And I need to, as I'm rereading it, I'm going to think about this from this perspective of the Missing Monarchy book. But as I recall, all of Aragorn's actual political power comes from oaths of fealty that people voluntarily give to him, and he's not a conqueror who comes subjecting the world to Gondor's rule, as I
Um,
recall.
yeah,
But I'm going to read it again. Yeah.
I have an article on that in the Post Still magazine that I will send you an email
Oh,
if you'd like. But yeah, Aragorn,
nice.
and that is a good point because that's one aspect of Lord of the Rings I kind of didn't like because I love Rohan and I love the Shire, and so to see a king kind of come to power more centralized to me is a negative. But looking at it, the history of Middle Earth, Aragorn's just taking back what was rightfully his realm, becoming of the northern and the southern kingdom. So he's not expanding. After the war, he makes allies with the Haradrim and the Easterling. He doesn't seek to conquer them or take away their customs. He says peace. Mordor, gets rid of, but he doesn't conquer those other people, even that he was at war with. And he also gives autonomy, complete autonomy. Like Gandalf, it's a bit of a spoiler for you, but when Gandalf head back to Bree, he talks to the innkeeper and he said that he heard there's a new king. He's worried. What's that going to mean? And Gandalf says, "Don't worry. He knows Bree and he loves Bree because he was Strider in Bree.
Right.
He's going to leave Bree alone, and he gives him complete autonomy, like kingship." Tolkien took from Anglo-Saxon England, which is a lot of my focus. And
Mhm.
so Bree, the Shire, the Ents, um, Faramir's autonomous in Athelion.
Mhm.
And so he doesn't control these areas. He's technically their king and their guardian, but he doesn't go regulate them or force their own laws. They're all diverse. Even in Gondor, as I mentioned in the article, it's the vassal's choice to send men to Minas Tirith. And most of the forests don't. They stay on the Gondorian coast because the Haradrim are doing sea invasions. They only lend to the capital, Minas Tirith, what they can spare. It's their choice. And same thing with Theoden, who's technically, as the king of Rohan, he's a vassal of the king of Gondor, which is why the steward sends an
Calls for help.
ambassador
Yeah.
saying, "Will you help us? Will you stay true to your oath?" It's fully up to Theoden what he does. And he says, "Yes, we will honor the oath." But he's fully autonomous within Rohan, which also has various lords. It's decentralized.
Hmm.
Eomer controls within his realm. So Lord of the Rings is a great example of medieval kingship. And that article, I think, touches on it, and I'll send it to you in an
Yeah,
email.
I'd like to read it. It makes me think further. If you haven't read the book, plug your ears because this isn't in the movie. When I think it may have been a direct contrast that I hadn't realized before, when Tolkien has Saruman, who clearly represents the state, start to encroach on the Shire,
Mm-hmm.
and he's forcing the hobbits to do things and cutting
Mm-hmm.
down trees and leveling homes and
Yeah.
eminent domain and all of that,
Yeah.
contrasting that with Aragorn's rule later,
Mm-hmm.
when they pretty much just keep doing what they want.
Great. And the Aragorn, I think, put one law in place where he said it's up to the hobbits who enters because it was outsiders that
Yes.
came in that infiltrated and corrupted the Shire from within, Saruman and Sharky and the ruffians. And so the one thing that's changed is that it's up to the hobbits to decide who's allowed in. And they still allowed dwarves and Gandalf and visitors and elves as they did before. But, they had that. It just kind of gave them an extra level of sovereignty and autonomy to say, we don't want people coming in here doing the same thing that happened before and destroying the Shire, turning it into this totalitarian industrial place, whereas there was a libertarian, self-government farmland. And I almost wanted to mention what I said to you. I take also from the Shire, which also is a medieval thing of, I don't want the laws in place in my ideal monarchy. I want the culture to do it. And if you read Tolkien, go back, read The Ordering of the Shire. And when he talks about the Shire, he says how the families, they were divided into the Tooks, the different leading families, and they were very tribal, he says. And I mentioned this in the article. And he said the families basically govern themselves in their own manners. So the Brandybucks would have their own way to dealing with, crime or trouble within their area, and the Tooks would as well. They're all in the Shire, but there's no law controlling it. It's a cultural family sort of, we're going to handle our business when someone gets out of line. And that's the type of thing that's, what I love about the Shire. And that would be part of my ideal sort of real life kingship today, if that were to be implemented.
Yeah, it sounds good to me. Decentralized government so that people can practice self-rule, as you say,
Right,
instead of people trying to fight each other to see who's going to rule
right.
by denying other people self-rule.
Yeah.
Well, the book, Missing Monarchy. Anything else, Jeb, that you'd like to pitch as long as we're here? Got the article. I can put that in
Yeah.
the link to the description of the video. Uh,
Awesome.
what else do you have going
Yeah.
on?
I mean, you can check out my books on Amazon. I'm starting a Substack, Jeb Smith at Substack, which I just began. My email, if anyone has any questions, you can email me at Jackson18611096 at Gmail. And, I'd love to hear from anyone. And thank you again for having me on.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Jeb.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like what we do here, please like, share, subscribe, comment, and go over to our website where you can offer donations, request help us help people who are in need voluntarily. And we'll see you next time.